All right. Thank you, everybody. We're playing a little cat and mouse game today of trying to run away from the noise. And they're trimming the canyon right next to the Bonhoeffer room wall. And so we knew that was going to be too loud to be in Bonhoeffer. So I moved it over here. And then when I got here this morning, I realized they had set the chipper up right there, which is smart. It gives them the quickest route to carry all those branches, the big bundles. But that means the sanctuary is no good. This room was no good. The administration building's even worse. And so we called the head of the organization, and they're just going to not do that from 10 to 11. So if you hear a chipper go off, that probably means it's 11 o'clock and time for us to move on. Welcome. Good to have you all here. Laureen is going to be monitoring the chat, and some of you have not had a chance to meet her yet. She's a retired Presbyterian pastor. Her husband, Ladd, his mother is up in Fullerton at the senior adult place where Barbara Brinkley lives, Morningside. And so they've been here to visit her, and they're here for a month. She's recently retired, so I've, of course, given her a job to do this week, and she's happily complied. She's going to lead our prayer Sunday morning during worship. And she's also going to be monitoring the chat for those of you who are watching online. That way I can just kind of carry on as I like to do, and she'll be able to monitor any comments that we need to share. She's passing around a sign-in sheet because typically Sue Ann will do that, but she is not here on the campus this week. Okay, so we are looking at number 10, the 10th of the Phoenix Affirmation. I'm going to reread it for everybody. One of the ways that we love ourselves is by claiming the sacredness of both our minds and our hearts, recognizing that faith and science, doubt and belief serve the pursuit of truth. So as I read this chapter, there are a couple of questions that have come up, not only in my mind, but a couple of you have raised them as well. But for Sunday's sermon, I wanted to talk about the state of the relationship between science and faith for Saturday and Sunday's sermon. And one of the claims that I made was that for the last 150 years at least, the conversation between science and faith has largely been carried out with regard to evolution versus creation. Creationism, evolutionary science. And so I want to kind of think backwards with you for a minute, or even think around that conversation a little bit about other ways that the conversation between science and faith becomes contentious or concerning for people, okay? So think about, for example, Galileo, right? Who noticed, first of all, that the earth moves. The earth moves. And he posited that instead of a geocentric galaxy, we live in a heliocentric galaxy, where it's actually the sun that's the center of it all, and the earth rotates around the sun, or revolves around the sun, as well as rotates in place. And of course, he was forced to recant that scientific truth at the threat of excommunication, which didn't mean at the time they kicked him out of his local church and he could go down the street and join a Baptist church, because church is a voluntary organization. That wasn't the scoop. The scoop was, if you're excommunicated from the church, you are being consigned to hell, because the Catholic notion at the time was, outside of the church, there is no salvation. So excommunication was a huge thing. It wasn't simply disfellowshipping somebody from your own particular community. That's Galileo, and it leads to the story, which I don't even know if this is true or if this is apocryphal, that when he recanted that the earth moves around, the earth is the center of the universe, he was said to have murmured at the end, and yet it moves. Right? It's kind of like, people crossing their fingers and holding it behind their back when they say, yes, I will do every job the church wants me to do, things like that. So there was a time when these scientific questions that brought up the tension between science and faith was not evolution. It was whether the earth is the center of the universe. And today, we don't even lose any sleep over that. And we kind of roll our eyes at it. But it was huge. It was a huge thing because the presumption of the scriptural stories, especially the creation motifs in the scriptures, is that the sun goes around the earth. It rises in the morning, it sets at night. We still use that language, we just don't mean it. But, we use it. And the reason we use it is because it's an empirically based science that what you see is what you get. What you see is what you get. That was the basis on which much of science and philosophy, and therefore religion, was carried out for many years. Aristotle, for instance, determined that women are by nature inferior to men. And it was not hard to see why. Men were in charge of everything. Men were the general, men were the captains of industry, men were the emperors. Women produced babies, they were fragile, they cried, they did all these things, and men were superior. So he's looking at the social structure in which he lived and drawing a conclusion from that empirical observation that women are not simply within this structure, but by nature inferior. It was really the most popular way of doing science for many, many years. You observe, you conclude. People like Einstein just changed that entirely when they started engaging in speculative science and imagining how something must be, not based on what one can observe, but based on speculating beyond what we can observe. And each of us buys into that to some extent, because even though we use the language of the sun rising in the morning and setting at night, we don't believe that's what's really happening. We will say that's how it looks. And we love to watch the sun go down over the water. It seems to speed up at the end. You can almost see it moving. And we gasp at that in wonder and beauty. But in fact, the sun's not doing a thing, right? Besides just sitting there being a sun. And what we're seeing was actually what it looked like quite some time ago. And it's the Earth's axial tilt that makes it look like that, right? It's the Earth's rotation that makes it look like that. So much of the biblical story, during that time, all of the biblical story, the science in the Bible is an empirically based science. So when Galileo suggests that the Earth itself is moving, rather than the fixed center of the universe, that had radical implications for whether or not the scriptures are true, or in what sense the scriptures might be true. And it was perceived as a threat. It also then suggested that maybe humans are not the center of the universe. And we have presumed that for many years. It's humans that do the presuming, right? And the humans are we're the ones who reflect on these matters. So obviously we see out of our own minds, we see through our own eyes. And so it was a threat to the dignity of humans. as was Darwin's suggestion. And it was a threat to the truth of the scripture. And so there has often been a tensive relationship, not always, but often been a tensive relationship between scriptural truth, and scientific ideas. And the nature of scientific ideas is that significant new ideas lead to a paradigm shift. And that's a real important phrase for you to kind of understand the passion behind religious resistance to science, is the paradigm shift that has to happen. Thomas Kuhn wrote a very famous piece on something about scientific revolution. And he talked about how the observations are one thing, but when it makes you stop and rethink your fundamental structure, that's when it becomes really problematic for people. And the reason I'm sharing all that is in the Darwinian creationist arguments, I think mostly Christians have engaged in that argument for reasons not related to science. I think it really is a matter of the nature, value, purpose, and meaning of human life that's at stake, not whether Abraham or Adam and Eve were the very first two humans ever. Many Christians argue terribly. I think they're not really focused on what's really at stake, and they make it about the science. And they say things, and I've heard this, like, well, if you want to think you're related to a monkey, go ahead, but I'm not. And they think they just scored, a zinger or something. I attended a Jimmy Swaggart revival once at the Hampton Coliseum. I was seated among the pastors who were supposed to be there to help pray for people when they came up. I was an intern in college working at a church, and the pastor sent me in his place. I remember during the middle of this sermon, Jimmy Swaggart really gets carried away with evolution, and he's talking about it. And at one point, he looks down at the ground as if he's talking down toward hell and says, "Do you hear that, Clarence Darrow?" And so there are really stupid Christian arguments against evolution that I want to bracket and say, that's just nonsense. And honestly, my life is too short to argue with these fools. I'm just going to put that there. What I do want to talk about with some Christian folk who struggle with science is, let's talk about the nature of human life. Let's talk about whether human life has dignity and purpose. Let's talk about whether evolutionary theory gives us the capacity to speak about beauty, value, purpose, meaning. And if it doesn't, then to some extent we accept evolutionary theory as a scientific argument, and we are saying that there's more to the human story than that. And that's the kind of field in which I think many of us end up falling. Now, the only reason I'm going on and on about it, I imagine sooner or later, Newport schools are going to decide whether to teach creationism. I don't know. There are significant, important questions that still exist with regard to the relationship between faith and science. What constitutes a human being? What constitutes a human life? You might say, well, you have a body, you have a mind, you have feeling. And then we have folks who are mentally incapacitated. Are they still human? Are they still worthy of that title and all the dignity and rights that go with that? We call some folks who are severely incapacitated vegetable. You've heard that all your life, right? And we don't mean that in a derogatory sense, but we are trying to say it in a sympathetic sense, that it just seems to be there's no quality of life happening there. And when that happens, is it loving, compassionate, merciful, just to prolong their life using extreme measures? Or would it be more loving, compassionate, just to let their life end? That's a real question. I have been sitting by the bedside of a man who was crying and then looked at the doctor and nodded when they turned the machine off, because his mother had simply reached the point to where they would not revive the her that he had always known. And she was being artificially, as it's called, kept alive. That's a real question. If your arm is dismembered, are you still human? Of course you are. If both arms are dismembered, are you still human? Of course you are. If your legs are gone too, and you're just this torso with a hat, are you still human? Of course you are. All your vital organs are intact. You can live that way. I do know a biblical professor who's only there from here up. And no one questions whether he's human. He's delightful, he's funny, he's smart. If you have an artificial heart and nothing but a torso and a head, are you still human? The reason I'm asking that question is because there will be a time when we are now being implanted with things in our brain. And if your mind is in its own accord not terribly functional, but it's being enhanced by some kind of artifice, some kind of artificial help, are you still human? Or have you now become a cyborg, which we always depict as threatening creatures, right? Because they're not human. Those are going to be available ethical questions in the near future. And, if there's someone that you love dearly whose life might be prolonged by some kind of artificial implant in their head, you may be much more open to it at that moment than you might be sitting here right now, theoretically thinking this all sounds like futuristic stuff. Those are places, I think, where science and faith necessarily bear both a complementary and attentive relationship. It's complementary because there's no time ever where, in order to embrace the Christian faith, you have to reject something that is true.
Would you say that again?
I will. Y'all write this down so it can be on the little epithet when they hang me in public. There's no time ever where, in order for you to embrace the Christian faith, you have to reject something that's true. Now, I'm not speaking on behalf of the Presbyterian Church, not even on behalf of St. Mark. That's a Mark Davisism right there. But I challenge you to think it through. And I understand that what we think is true is not a fixed thing, that there's interpretation, there's better understanding, and all of those things. Dogmatism is a problematic thing in both faith and science. But it sounds weird for someone in church to say, there is no point at which you have to sacrifice your Christian faith in order to embrace something that's true. Because we have often, okay, just a moment for those of you online, they're going to continue to cut things down. They're just not going to turn on the chipper. So I thank you, Jerome. If someone shows up unreasonably late, we can either let them in or teach them a lesson. Thank you very much. Okay. I have completely lost my train of thought, but I'm sure it was profound, whatever it was. Okay. So the issue between science and faith and an affirmation that embraces both is, to me, a wonderful thing. But I don't want to embrace it naively and pretend that there won't be tensions. Of course, there will. And there will be times that the science needs to be tamed and put in its proper place. And for example, noticing that evolutionary thinking cannot fully explain things like beauty, truth, love, value, purpose. And there are times that scientific thinking will simply force us to rethink some of the dogma we once thought was true. And it strikes me that a faithful response to that is not simply to shut out the science in the name of we were right all along, but to say, if this is true, then God is in it. So let us think through again, anew, what it is we believe. And I want to say that we'll get to this book in just a minute. So it's so much better than me. But I want to say that I think you see this happening in the scripture. So in the first creation story, day one, God separates the light from the darkness. It's not the sun. It's light and darkness. Separated the light from the darkness. The light is called day, the darkness is called night. There was day and there was night. And God said it was good. And there was day and there was night the first day. The second day, God separates the dome from the earth. So we have the sky and the earth. This is a two-dimensional view of the earth. It's a flat earth. It's got the sky, it's got the ground. They are separated, two different things. God said it's good. That's the second day. The third day, God created the great lights, the sun to rule by day, and the moon to rule by night. No. Sorry. Go back to the second day. God separates the dome from the earth and fills the earth with vegetation. Fills the earth with vegetation. The third day, God creates the great lights, the sun to rule by day and the moon to rule by night. Vegetation before sun. The science of the ancient Near East knew that you needed moisture, but had not yet factored in, at least in this telling, that the sun is required for vegetation to grow. I mean, it's not a big deal. And if you had pushed them up against the wall and told them you need the sun, they might have said, okay. But in telling this story, vegetation comes before the sun, which shows that in their way of thinking empirically about how the world is, you have vegetation, obviously needs water. There are deserts that don't have vegetation, but there are beautifully watered places that do. So you have vegetation, you have moisture, you have all of that. But until the third day, there's no sun. And by the time Jesus tells the story of the parable of the sower, Now we have a new science on the horizon that recognizes the role of the sun in plants and seeds germinating and growing. It's a change. It's a small change. I get it, but it's a change. And it's an interesting change because they're already pushing past a little bit the empiricism and making the connection that the sun is somehow instrumental in germinating seeds and growing plants. That's a scientific development between the first creation story, probably written about the time of the Babylonian exile, and so what, 500 years before the Common Era, and the parable of the sower written around 70 years of the Common Era. So over that time, there's a little bit of a different science, and the story simply reflects. They don't have to go back and fix the old science. They don't resist it. They just reflect it. They reflected the science of marriage. Back in the old days, you had to have several wives because you needed lots of kids because you had land to work and fill. By the New Testament time, most people had been citified. They had been brought into the city because of the way that the Roman Empire structured work, or they were in small communities. And all those children were mouths to feed, and it was hard. And the family structure changed. And the first family planning process was instituted by Julius Caesar, who wanted one man and one woman, as opposed to multiple spouses. It was Julius Caesar. Now, eventually they dropped it because neither Julius Caesar nor most of his senators in Rome were willing to follow it. But in principle, that's what they were the first ones to really try to structure the nuclear family. That changed, and it changed because of the circumstances around them, and it changed among both the Jews and the Gentiles. So during the time of Abraham, he had several wives, but so did all of his pagan neighbors. That's just what marriage was. It was driven by economics. And by the New Testament time, it was mostly one man, one woman with children, and driven by economics. And it wasn't unique to Christians or Jews. It was the way things were. Science runs that way as well. It's a set of agreements that we all have concluded. And in the earliest days, it was all based on empiricism. Okay. We will face even more science, faith, tension, relational challenges as artificial intelligence continues. And it seems to me that if the church is not going to simply be an irrelevant institution over here fighting the flat earth fight, we have to lean into this relationship between the mind and the heart, science and faith. Okay, end of sermon number 2. Okay, let me ask, did you have any questions, concerns about the chapter and or the sermons from this past week that you wanted to share for us to discuss? Is there anything in the chat room, Lorraine?
Nothing.
Okay, thank you. All right. Okay, Jerome and Judy had a question, and I did want to use that as a chance to share what I suspect with all of you. This conversation between Linda and Janet, they ask if it's real. And this is my guess. Please feel free to write that question down. 2 weeks from today, Eric will join us over Zoom, and we can ask him directly, okay? Is this a real conversation? And I want to say the answer is probably sort of. And I am explicitly projecting myself onto this as someone who's both written and preaches numerous sermons and occasionally peppers those books or articles or sermons with real life stories. I can almost guarantee you their names are not Linda and Janet. And I think that explains why at one point he refers to Linda as Janet or Janet as Linda. Yeah. Listen, if he gave them their real name, I don't think he would have done that because he would have been able to keep them clear. But when you use an alias, I took my hand at writing a novel once, and I had to go back and keep a sheet of who this was and approximately how old they were and who they're related to, because, you know, after about 50 pages, it starts getting kind of murky. So my suspicion is it's a real conversation between two women. Could be two men, and this is the great alias. I'm almost sure their names are not Linda and Janet. Linda sounds to me like a member of Eric's church in Scottsdale. The way that she makes her arguments based on things they talked about in their Bible study and so forth, I'm just almost sure Eric led that Bible study, right? This sounds to me like that's the situation here. It also sounds like Eric was not there. So at most, he's hearing about this conversation from Janet, or allegedly, or Linda. See, I can't keep the name straight either because they're not real. And obviously, he's enhancing it. He's enhancing it. It's becoming a parable of sorts, where Janet represents the kinds of things one might say in the best tradition of conservative circles, and Linda represents the best that one might say in the best tradition of more progressive circles. I think that's probably what's going on here. I think it's fair game. When you use an illustration, like when I use an illustration in a sermon, I learned in a really strong way one time, always use an alias. Always use an alias. I mean, I talked about a kid I grew up with once, and that boy found that sermon online and contacted me and was very unhappy about it. It's a little late to practice evangelism at that point. So I think it's fair game. I think it's a typical conversation. And I think what Eric tries to do is something that's really kind of brilliant. You know, he participated in what he called Crosswalk America, where he walked from Phoenix to DC, embracing these affirmations. This was, I think, before the book was written. And he wanted to have conversation just like this. Because if you look at the conversation, it started out that Janet believed in a young earth 6-day creation. And Linda believed in a billion-year-old earth with an evolutionary flow to it. And it seemed like that's the thing they didn't recognize in each other, and the thing that they spent so much time trying to avoid talking about, and finally had to hash it out a little bit. In the end, what became evident was while Janet may still believe in a young earth, etc., and Linda doesn't, they heard one another at a different level. Janet was concerned that if you think of life in terms of evolutionary science, as opposed to the creation and fall in Genesis 1, 2, and 3, then the death of Jesus for her had no real purpose or meaning to it, because humans were not sinful and death was not the consequence of sin. So what exactly was Jesus saving us from? if we're all going to die anyway. So now we got a theological structure that attributes sin as a consequence, or death as a consequence of sin, and the death of Jesus then being a way for us to say death does not have the last word. There's now resurrection and the possibility of new life. So much of that theological structure, we always say, yeah, that's the Christian story, that through Christ we have new life. You know, we wouldn't say it quite in those terms, but that's what was at stake for Linda or for Janet, and Linda had no idea. At the same time, for Linda, she wasn't embracing evolution because she thought the Bible was just a bunch of crock. She embraced evolution because she read the Bible and she saw very clearly that there's a creation story in Genesis 1. There's another creation story in Genesis 2. The story of the fall, if that's what we're going to call it, actually accompanies the second story. The second story, Genesis 2 and 3, probably older in its origin than the first story. And they're different. And they're different. And having seen that, Linda's sense of what it means to be a faithful Christian is to say, look, the story is not told as if this first creation story is all there is to it. It's told as if this is one way of talking about creation. Oh, very quickly, here's another one. And it's different. The order of creation is different in the second chapter than it is in the first. When I was in college, they taught us the second chapter is just a commentary on the first. And when we said, how can it be a commentary if the order is shifted? You don't do that in a commentary. You expand in a commentary. You don't fix. I was told, I said we, but it's true. I was told that I was being a bit of a brat. That's why I've often said it wasn't until seminary that my heart and my head could occupy the same space. But that's an interesting, so I want you to hear that, whether the story in itself is true, verbatim or anything like that, is a little bit beside the point. It's an author's privilege to recount a story in which he's not involved, to make a point. And his point was precisely, I think, what he was after in his crosswalk, which is to find somebody where it appears at the start that we are starkly opposition to one another, and to talk through our differences to where we can really understand what's at stake with one another. And that's kind of tough, isn't it? But it does seem like that's a way of loving. Yes, ma'am.
One of the things in listening to both Linda and Janet in the dialogue that I was hearing, both of them had done their statement of faith. And there are times when my professors would say evangelistic individuals have their 30-second elevator speech. You ever all heard that?
Yeah.
Where they could say what they believe very quickly in a 30-second elevator. Whereas as Presbyterians, we have this statement of faith. And Mark, if you've ever done any work with individuals that are candidates becoming ministers, but there's a lot of emphasis placed on that, to say what you believe. And so what I got out of listening to that dialogue was a reaffirmation. What do I believe? What are the things that are really important in my faith? And I appreciated hearing both sides.
Yeah. Well, and I think Jerome made the comment that they were arguing in a way that hardly any of us argued, right? It was very sophisticated. They had thought it through, and were able to articulate things that a lot of times we just kind of generally say, well, this is our side, and leave it at that. I think this is where the dialogue with people who are very different from us can be so helpful. But notice, in the end, they did not agree, and they had not changed their politicized opinion. You still had one who thought you have to teach creationism in school to really convey truth, and you had the other who said, no, that what you're talking about is not science, it's faith, and it belongs in the church. So they stayed different, but they understood each other a little bit better. That's different from saying they came out in full agreement. Yes, Joanne.
And wasn't it Linda that kind of held back, even though she understood and would like to talk about it? She held back and let the other person say what she felt.
Yeah, and there was a moment, and I think this is good storytelling, where each of them had to bite their tongue a little bit. You know, you could get the sense they wanted to interject and say, but come on, you know, but they had to let the others speak. That's interesting, isn't it?
And arguments often, you want to tell what you think.
Right.
You don't hold back and let them tell what they think.
Right. There's been a lot of great reflection on the act of listening. And listening in order to respond is not listening. Listening in order to understand is listening. And I think whenever we're in a contentious context, we typically we listen in order to respond. Yes, but, however, you know, and instead of, wow, I had no idea. What a great response that was when one of them was able to say that to the other. I had no idea. That's what was really hurting you at this time. Yeah. Bonnie Stachowiak sent me a text yesterday with a link to a book. And she said, I'm hearing from a group of folks who really feel like this is a very good book. Now, it's published by a publishing house from which I don't typically buy my books. But that, you know, I just have to acknowledge that and say that doesn't mean they're wrong. It means I may need to expand my repertoire a little bit. And it's about talking to Christian nationalists and how to love them. And it sounds simple, I know, but nothing is more off-putting to me than a fighting Christian nationalist who seems to take everything I hold sacred and use it as a battering ram. And I think it's a clear demonstration of using God's name in vain. I think it's typically hate speech that's just cloaking itself in faith speech. And I'm against it. I'm blogging about the Project 2025 because I think it's dangerous. I think it's dangerous to the integrity of faith as much as to the integrity of the country. And at the same time, I have to acknowledge that my number one Christian duty is to love, not to correct. And sometimes love in public means to speak out and be prophetic. Love and truth are inherently connected. But approaching the Christian nationalists through the lens of love has not always been my first inclination. So now I have to say to myself, okay, despite the publisher, you ought to get this book and see if there are blind spots in me that is so determined to set the record straight. I've often felt like I spend more time deconstructing bad images of Christianity than we get to spend simply living into the best of Christianity. And I resent that at a really, really deep level. But perhaps I'm carried away with that too. So having read this chapter, I got that link and I thought, dang it.
Yeah.
Now I have to be like Linda and Janet and listen to each other. and you know what? Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Yes, ma'am.
What is the book?
Well, if I weren't using my phone as a camera right now, I could go to that text and tell you, but I can't. Did all of you get the email I sent out about the room change? Okay, did you not, you haven't, I think it was last year's list. I was just trying to tell people. I'll add you to it and I'll just send the link to this book. And you know, you can either get it or you can tell me, you go ahead and read it. Tell us, you know, after you read it, whether you still recommend it. I don't care. Okay. Any other questions, comments about this chapter? Okay. I don't have my computer in front of me, and I can't really read the clock because of the glare. What time are we at here? 10 till. Okay. All right. Y'all have to come up with things or else I'll keep that. Yes, ma'am.
Mark, you just exhibited when you talked about Janet and Linda, our capacity to try to use the words of the person that you disagree with, so that it's not an attack, it's you're trying to enter into their realm.
Right.
At the same time, what I noticed Linda did that I appreciated is I felt Janet wanted her to say certain things. And if she said those certain things, she was on the team. And what Linda did, which I thought was brilliant, but also very much her heart, was to, I think the term we hear now is pivot. Instead of being swept up like that wave in the sand into Janet, she said, Linda did what she believed. And that was more important. That was more of an affirmation than an argument.
Right.
I found that generated because I felt the same way that you did. I was like, oh gosh, I have to deconstruct all of this and figure out why is it hurting me so much.
Yeah.
Rather than reaching the box.
I do have the feeling at times that we are better at being able to identify what's ridiculous in someone else's argument than we are at simply stating ours. And sometimes maybe that's easier. And you were asking about writing a statement of faith.
Yeah. Have you all done that?
No. Well, we do it in this respect. Our confirmands write a statement of faith, right? And back when I was teaching confirmation, this was a really rigorous thing. They had to learn how to write it. I gave them an outline of the things they need to address. They would write it. They would exchange it with each other and refine it. Then they would read it to their family and refine it. And then they would read it to an elder and refine it before they ever went public. And, you know, by the time they got to the final product, they had been asked a zillion questions, which I think is a great process. Last week, Sujeen Coe met with our Committee on Preparation for Ministry with the Presbytery. And we came in on Thursday. She preached a sermon and they listened, and there were about 8 St. Mark folk there to give her friendly faces. And then we went into a period where they asked her questions about the sermon and about her statement of faith, which they thanked her for keeping it to a page. In the end, there were other things they wanted her to add, so I don't think they're really committed to a page. Those are the places where we often end up pushing each other to really think through our statement of faith. The other places where it happens is when people join, I tell them, we're going to ask you 4 questions, right? And the answers are Jesus Christ, yes, yes, yes. And I go over the 4 questions in our new members class. And it's interesting because the conversations we have there are generally very good. We have a number of folks that are willing to say Jesus Christ, you know, to the question, who is your Lord and Savior? If we followed that with what does that mean? Land sakes, we'd be all over the map, right? And that's where the interesting conversation comes in. And when we have some folks for whom Jesus Christ is a prime example of human life. We have some folks for whom Jesus Christ is the unique Son of God and existed long before creation and will exist after creation demise and is eternal with God and the Holy Spirit. We're a little less clear on that part. And very, very orthodox in that regard, but perhaps struggle a bit to talk about how such a Christ could have really been human. I mean, really? Was his death really terrifying if he knew he was Jesus? Could he really be hungry if he could just snap his fingers and make food? I mean, this was magic, you know. So you start pushing people. What does it mean to say Jesus Christ is your Lord and Savior? What does that phrase Jesus Christ mean? Suddenly you start seeing that many of us have different ideas, and somewhere in the vortex of fully human and fully God to describe Jesus, we land. But boy, is it a spectrum. And I don't think it's a waste of time for us to delve into what it is that we mean by that. You know, I'm a happy nerd, and those are great conversations. A lot of people are just much more practical, and I appreciate that as well. So yeah, we probably could be a little more forthright, but we don't want to become that church that says, well, if you haven't articulated this fully or well or perfectly, then you don't belong. In the end, we're going to say, we're glad you're here. You are a beloved child of God, weird as you may be. We're going to say that in the end. So I think we feel like we're being pushed if we challenge and dialogue.
That's what Jesus would do. What you just said. If he said, come on in. That's what he would do.
That's certainly, I think that's certainly how most people here feel. That's exactly what you do. Yeah. You know, we're part of a tradition that loves to write things down, right? We've got the Westminster Confession, the Heidelberg Confession. We have 10 different confessional statements in our book of confession. And I've had some serious discussions at the presbytery level whether our faith is primarily a propositional faith or an existential one. And of course, you have to flesh out the meaning of those things. And well, there are those who say primarily it's proposition. There are certain things that are true, and if you believe that, then you are saying the right thing. And without that, you're on a wrong path. They're not going to say you're going to hell. They're not like that, but they feel like you're sincerely wrong. And you know, I'm not going to say they're sincerely wrong. I'm saying we're sincerely different in that respect. Okay, and we're going far afield. Did you have something? Okay. Any other questions or comments? All right, we're going to wrap up before they start chipping away behind us. Thank you all for switching. We'll be back in Bonhoeffer next week, so far as I know. But if I hear otherwise, I'll let you know. And I'll try to remember today to send that email with the link to the book that Bonnie sent to me in case you're interested. All right. Thank you. Next week, we have another great chapter.